When I was on ER rotation during med school, we got a call about a 23-year-old woman who was shot in the head and who was already completely gone, but was reportedly 5 months pregnant. So they were doing CPR until they got her to the hospital to see if the baby was viable. They got her to the ER and did an ultrasound, and turned out the baby was full term. They did a C-section in under a minute and got the baby out. I don't think it's so incredibly uncommon, but it was pretty surreal to see a baby delivered from a dead person with their brain exposed. And she was pretty close to the same age I was at the time. 2. When I was in my 3rd year medical school, I rotated in geriatrics. As many of you know, most of medicine isn't saving lives. It's a lot of taking care of the dying and elderly that's just knocking on heaven's door. Anyway, I had a census of maybe 5 patients. 4 of them were Gomers with severe dementia. I was checking on this one guy who would say the most random shit all day long. For example, I would ask, "Are you feeling any better?" And I would get, "I really think cucumbers are the devil." One day, I was listening to his lungs. He looks deep into my eyes and he says, "I'm dying from the inside, and I know it. I don't have long left." Pure 100% lucidity. I was a little taken aback and checked with him and said, "You what?" And he went back to staring off and said, "I like taking pictures of shells." Short-lived, but that 5 seconds he was all there was incredibly creepy. 3. ER nurse here was doing CPR on a lady whose heart had stopped. They initially rolled her into the room unconscious and not breathing. This lady is pretty much dead. However, in the middle of doing chest compressions, her hand reaches up and grasps my wrist and then falls back to hanging off the table. We never got her back. 4. Working the night shift as medical on call. I'll explain that I'm easily startled. It's around 3 a.m. and I'm back on a ward where I started my night to see how an unwell patient from the start of my shift is getting on. I have a chat with the nurses at the desk. They tell me he's much better and most recent OBS are improved, but that his chart is on the end of his bed. No problem. I trot off to the bedside. In I go, pull the curtains round, and to not wake the other sleeping patients in the bay, I use my torch, or flashlight, to check his chart. All looks good, and I'm happy. I turn around, and suddenly, in the dark, I'm toe-to-toe with a hunched-over old man, who has obviously noiselessly crept in behind me. Well, I just about have a heart attack of my own right there. I jump back, scream, and knock over a drip stand. He starts to yell, and nurses come running, someone wheeling the crash trolley. "Oh, doctor, that's just Albert. He likes to have a wander at night." 5. Whenever you admit a patient, you have to inquire about their do not resuscitate status in case of a code being called. I had one elderly patient, late 80s, early 90s, who was severely demented and chronically ill, in and out of the hospital every month, barely holding on to life, basically like a horrible, miserable quality of life. I asked the patient's family. I think it was a granddaughter who had medical POA, but I'm not sure, it was a while ago. And their do not resuscitate status, you don't want to put someone through a brutal resuscitation that may not even work if it isn't something that they want, if they want to die naturally. And she flat out said, "Oh, we want everything done for him because we really need his check." I didn't understand at first, but apparently the family was living off of his social security and could have cared less about his pain and suffering or his wishes. I'm pretty sure it was the creepiest thing I've ever encountered. These people were supposed to be his loved ones taking care of him, and they were using him like an inhuman object. 6. Relative of mine worked in a cancer unit. Acquaintance of mine was diagnosed and became their patient. The poor girl came from the whitest of trash. They were 6 to 7, living in a trailer with dying grandpa on a ventilator in the living room. They were keeping him around for the check too. The mom denied anything beyond the most basic of treatments for the daughter. She was an adult, but left weak and ill from a couple radiation doses. The mother's excuse was that her daughter was needed at home to take care of the mother's new baby. That's right, she literally sacrificed her oldest daughter to take care of her youngest because she couldn't be expected to do it all. I saw the family a couple of times after the daughter passed. I remember the callousness over her death. It was all bitching about bills and the loss of welfare because they were now down to 5 in the household. 7. Former critical care and ED nurse here. 2 stories, both of which occurred at a large Houston hospital in the mid-1980s. Every time I tell them, I get medical types telling me I'm lying. I'm not. Both are from the ED. Story 1. EMS brings in a young man, about 25. He is in a decerebrate posture, stiff hands and partial fists turned out, indicating deep brain damage, and being mutually bagged. As he came in the door, he was not intubated. According to EMS, his significant other had found him in bed with another woman, either drunk or deeply asleep. She carried a .25 caliber pistol with her, and the report was she placed the weapon directly against the patient's skull and pumped 10 rounds into his brain from various angles. The rounds were powerful enough to enter the skull and bounce around, but not exit. All higher brain function was destroyed, but autonomic functions remained. We intubated him and placed him on one of the old Bourne's Bear ventilators, very primitive by today's standards. This caused the patient to buck, as in fight, against the ventilator with deep coughs. When he did so, the pressure within his head increased and little fountains of brain matter would be expelled from the 10 holes in his skull, several feet. One got me in the face. I was pretty well protected by clinical distance at the time, but I must admit this really got to me. There was really nothing that could be done for him other than supportive care, and he died a few weeks later of a massive infection. Jesus Christ. It's like my body's trying to get that story out of my gut. Story 2. This counts as 8. Another young man had agreed to be mummified in a rather extreme sexual practice. Essentially, he was placed in a full-body plaster cast covering even his face and was given breathing tubes through the cast. Other than that, he was fully encased in the cast, with the exception of his toes and genital anal area. My understanding was this extreme degree of helplessness was considered erotic. The normal practice was to use a cattle prod or some similar device rectally to force ejaculation, but in this case, either through ignorance or malice, he was directly connected to 220 volts with one probe in his rectum and the other probe on his foot. He had third-degree burns over his entire genital and perianal area, deep burns on his foot, and from the smell, severe burns elsewhere. Blood, feces, and serous fluid was leaking from what had once been his rectum. We tried removing the cast to see if any degree of resuscitation was possible, but by the time it was even partially off, it was clear he was quite dead. All of us just stood there with our mouths open, utterly unable to say anything. The police came, and they too were mute. I volunteered to remove the entire cast and render some level of post-mortem care. I found deep lacerations over much of his body, deep bruising, and quite a few other burns. We sent the body to the medical examiner, and I spent the rest of the shift trembling and vomiting. 9. I work in a personal care home. We used to have a resident who would constantly yell out, "Hello." Drove us a bit bonkers. After he passed away, a lady moved into the room. One night I was working a double, evening to nights. She pulled her call bell. I went in, and she asked me to make him stop. Make who stop what? "The old man standing beside the bed. He won't stop yelling hello." That's that story. 10. Nothing I can say possibly describes the year I worked in psychiatric intensive care. Creepy isn't the thing that comes to mind when I think back on it. More heartbreaking and horrifying. But creepiness was part of it, especially evening and night shifts, naturally. There's always something disturbing about watching someone while they hallucinate. You can tell it's 100% real to them, and something about that makes you believe it on some level. A lot of stories end with, "And of course, I had to look over my shoulder to make sure." You see the emotions it brings out. Here's a couple of stories. There was a woman that came in and sat down across the table from me for her admission interview. She had bandages all over her arms and scotch tape over her mouth and ears. She looked very uncomfortable and wouldn't really sit still. When the nurse would ask her a question, she would peel the corner of the tape back and answer, then stick the tape back on really fast. We eventually found out that she saw and felt bugs crawling all over her, and they were trying to get inside her body. The tape was to keep the bugs out. The bandages were because some bugs got in, and she had to dig them out. She couldn't sit still because she felt the bugs all over her while she sat and talked. The worst part was she had some idea that it was her mind playing tricks on her. Can you imagine going through your life feeling like someone is continuously dumping buckets of cockroaches on your head, feeling like they're all over you and getting inside of you, to the point that you're digging chunks of your flesh out in panic, all while knowing intellectually that none of it is real? Another story. A girl spent my entire 8-hour shift fist-fighting the same ghost. She would throw a few punches and obviously land and knock out blows, so she'd bend over and twist her hand around like she was wrapping some long hair around her fist. She'd drag the opponent down the hallway, give a few good kicks, and then set up for a curb stomp. Starts off kinda funny, then gets a little disturbing when you think about the graphic things going on in her mind. Then just sad after you watch this replay for hours on end.